Here is NX-01 secrets you need to know. Are you just take my flesh next time? It would have been less painful. And you know what? Let's just cast all that cynicism aside for 1 second, because this is a very special episode of the Dolphin series, because we haven't just scoured technical manuals, we haven't just scoured the internet like we normally do. We have gone to the man himself, the myth, the legend, the G, Doug Drexler, to ask him all the things we don't know about the ship that we should tell you about the ship. And he went, oh, you know what? All right. I'll tell you. And tell us he did. So now this is me, Adam Cleary, on TrekCulture, telling you. Number 10, Faith of the Art. Now, back in the day, the show was just called Enterprise. Not Star Trek Enterprise, just Enterprise. And when they were coming up with the design for the ship, they had the entire spectrum of Star Trek ship design to go from. First Contact wasn't long out, so you basically had the Phoenix at one end of the spectrum, all the way to the Enterprise E at the other, and the designs were all of them somewhere between the two. Specifically, illustrator John Eaves in 2001, when talking about the design of the ship, said pretty much the same thing. He would go from one end of the spectrum, the Phoenix, to the other end, the Enterprise E, and it was just never quite what the producers of the show wanted to see. And then something happened. They went through all the existing ship designs, all the things that had been kicking around which hadn't really had too much screen time, and they found the USS Thunderchild, the Akira class ship from Star Trek First Contact. And something began to gestate between the designers and the producers, and the idea of just literally using that ship was floated. Then, of course, the art department got wind of this and went, whoa, 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 you can't just use a ship from 200 years in the future and think nobody's going to notice. The internet will lose its damn mind. I would have lost my damn mind. But if that's what you want, if you like that design, we can start to build something around that. And they started incorporating elements from the Thunderchild into the overall look of the new NX-01. And, well, pretty similar when you look.
It might be a myth, but there is at least the story that the producers wanted to wholesale use the CGI model from First Contact, the Akira class.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah.
How did you feel about that at the time?
Peter Lawrence called me and said, can you get the Akira model from Foundation Imaging? I said, yeah, I could get it. And he had suggested using the Akira. Nobody saw it, he said. It's like a new ship, you know. And Herman and I were both really disturbed by that. But if you look at Star Trek history, it's not unusual. You know, in the Next Generation, you could find pictures of Herman Zimmerman and Rick Berman looking at the Enterprise A from the movie series. They were considering using that. So they're always trying to save money, you know.
Number 9, A New Ride. It's a story that never gets widely talked about this, but because there was such a small amount of time between Voyager ending and Enterprise starting and there being all this pressure from the network to really get a snappy turnaround on it, they were literally deconstructing the Voyager set during the filming of its last few episodes. Like Kate Mulgrew and Rob Picardo both talked about the fact that they would literally finish a scene in one room and then they would just delete the room, which you'd think adds a real emotional heft to a show like that. You've been doing it for so many years and the ship is being destroyed around you as you film your last season. Anyway, that's another story. But the thing is, while it's another story, it's actually a much bigger story than just the destruction of Voyager, because those original sets, the ones that would become Voyager, actually dated back on that Paramount lot to 1977. They were built for that aborted Planet of the Titans Star Trek revival film/series or whatever the hell it was supposed to be. Then that got repurposed into the motion picture, which stayed around for the movies, which ended up in The Next Generation, which ended up in part of Deep Space Nine, but largely went on to be Voyager and the Enterprise E. Like, we've done loads of videos about the reused sets. They all dated back from 1977, and then at the end of Voyager, they just got boomf, knocked over. Which means that if Star Trek Enterprise had anything that none of the other shows did, as well as, of course, Hoshi, My Heart, it's that it had brand new sets. For the first time since the 70s, they actually built new sets for Star Trek. Stage 9 had been home to pretty much every single thing Star Trek for decades until this point, but Enterprise was filmed on Stage 18 with brand new ships and brand new walls and brand new floors and brand new everything. It is interesting. Don't look at me like that. Number 8, Star Treks. Just want to quickly take a moment to throw some appreciation to Paul Sutherland, who writes these wonderful articles for us, because Star Trek has really amused me. Well done. It was actually Paul who spoke to Doug Drexler himself. One of the most interesting things he came out with was the detail in this ship that we never saw on screen was insane. Like, because of advances in computer technology, they were able to realize everything about the exterior of the ship in microscopic detail, meaning they could just throw all kinds of practical or useful or interesting things onto it, and whether the show ended up using them was another matter entirely. But one of the best ones by a mile was this.
They did an episode called Minefield, where they had Malcolm trudge halfway across the primary hull to get to this mine that was on the hull. It really makes them look unprepared and stupid, okay? That they have to walk and carry the stuff halfway around the hull. You can see the grid work on the hull and the plate work on the hull. And the idea is that there are cars that you could ride to any section, rise up out of the hull and ride to any section on the ship to do repair work. Not only that, the NX has several arms like the International Space Station, so it can remotely, fix things on the warp themselves without anybody ever leaving the ship.
Now, if you, like me, hear that and you go, oh, it's a real shame that these cool cars that could just zip around the top of the ship and these arms that would come out to fix the nacelles. That's so interesting. Why did they never use that? I actually thought about it for 5 seconds, and the reason they never used that is because where is the drama? There's a mine on the ship. Okay, I'll just take the car. The warp nacelle's broken. That's cool. I'll just use the claw. It removes all the drama. You need things to break and be terrible and be bad and be underprepared, because otherwise, what are they doing every week? Number 7, Cover Girl. Well, would you look at that, it seems an early version of the ship went out in marketing materials and promo stuff, and it wasn't the finished version of the actual thing. Now, unlike other ones we've done in this series where they've changed the overall design, or they've changed the colors, or they've changed something dramatic about the ship, the change that was made in the Enterprise between when it ended up on this magazine cover and when it debuted in Broken Bow was very small, and it was literally very small. It was literally a percentage change in one of its components. Just going to give you a couple of seconds. This is the TV Guide Enterprise. It was the first time anybody saw it. Just look at that. Does anything look slightly bigger to you than it is in reality? Anything? It's the windows.
If you look at that compared to what was on the show, one, it was brighter, but you'll notice that the windows are a couple of percent larger on that model. And I liked that better. I thought it made the ship seem more vulnerable. Somewhere along the line, they made the windows smaller.
It did live, though. It did survive just being on that TV Guide cover. That is the same model they used for all the internal all the instruments. That's the version that's on all the instruments. Number 6, From Akira to NX. What was that? Adam, didn't you just do an entry where you talked about the direct comparisons between the Akira-class USS Thunderchild and the NX-01 Enterprise? It would be really weird if you then did an entry which talks about the differences between the two, wouldn't it? Yeah, it would, but guess what? Now, yes, okay, you look at it, you see the twin booms, you see the big notch at the back, you see the overall shape of the saucer section, you do see large similarities, and yes, it is true that initially the idea was floated to just use the Akira class for the NX-01 Enterprise, but Doug, the man who would know, told us that the similarities are not as obvious and not as prominent as a lot of critical fans may have pointed out.
If you put the Akira next to the NX, they really don't look the same, but the one thing that it does have, that it borrows, are the twin booms that are like a P-38 Lightning.
Right. That
was the perfect idea to not have a secondary hull, and Starfleet had done it already. To freak out or get pissed off because this came from the Akira, that's crazy. They're the ones who's crazy, because just look at Starfleet ships. The whole aesthetic is, they all borrow from one another. It's mix and match.
And do you know what? He's right. I always quite liked the fact that it looked similar to ships that existed in the future because, and yes, this is very much hindsight being 2020, but think of the criticism the Discovery got because it looked nothing like any other ship we'd seen. Like, the fact that they took design inspiration from a ship in the future means that you can make the narrative argument that the Akira class took design inspiration from the ship in the past. One big happy fleet. Number 5, a primitive beast. Now, one of the major similarities between the Akira class and the NX-01 is that big pod thing that it's lugging behind it. Now, on the Akira class, that is where all the whooping is stored, but on the NX-01, it is something completely different. Now, I always thought, incorrectly I might add, that's where the engineering bay was, because I don't know, that's just how I pictured it in my head. I know engineering's in the source section somewhere like that, but I always thought that was engineering. And while I was wrong, I wasn't totally wrong, apparently. According to Doug, that bit is there to show that the ship is not as advanced as the Star Trek ships we are used to. It just never really came up in the show. Like, the idea is, in the Star Trek of the future we all know and love, the warp bubble, the warp field, is generated by the nacelles. It surrounds the ship and allows it to travel at faster than light speeds. Now, of course, the warp nacelles did do that on the NX-01, but they weren't as advanced as the ones we knew, and they couldn't properly generate the bubble very well. They could, but it wasn't symmetrical, it wasn't safe. So they had this special generator at the back of the ship which made it far more shapely and luxurious and made it a lot more safe. Never came up on the show, but that's what it was for.
Yeah, Mike and I decided that to make the ship a little more primitive, the warp field that it generated was not symmetrical. It was asymmetrical, and that created a problem. It could be dangerous. So that pod was the symmetrical warp governor, and basically that additional generator could shape the warp field for it, and they still needed that when the refit rolled around. Eventually you get rid of it, you know.
The idea behind having this big lumpy thing at the back was to make it not look as sleek and as well thought out and as well rounded and as sexy as something like the Constitution class, because that is all just one shape here and one shape here and one shape there, whereas the NX-01 was lumpy bits because they hadn't figured everything out yet. It kind of makes sense.
It looks like an ironclad next to the Constitution class. The Constitution class is sleek and smooth like a marine animal. It's not like any spaceship you've ever seen before. The NX-01's got plates on it, and it's primitive next to the Constitution class.
Number 4, sexy engines. Anyway, speaking of the Enterprise and all its sexy, sleek bits, despite it trying to look far more primitive than that ship, Doug did admit that they snuck in loads of cool little references to the original Enterprise as and where they could, and look no further, my friends, than the warp nacelles. On the original Enterprise, the ends of the nacelles with their hooded cones suggest exhaust. That was remedied by adding spheres. I kept that for the ends of the NX nacelles, but split the sphere in two. If the front of the nacelles looks like penises, I compounded that by making the ends of the NX nacelles look like a girl's butt in a thong. I thought that was fair. Girl's butt in a thong. A girl's butt in a thong. Anybody else? A girl's butt in a thong? Maybe I've just seen the wrong butts. Number 3, Mod Squad. Alright, yeah, there was the train cars and there were the robotic arms and all this cool stuff we never got to see, but one other thing that was literally listed in the design schematic but never appeared on screen was this bit, the back of the main hull, the back of the saucer section. Now you, like me, might expect that to be a shuttle bay because that's just where it is on every other ship, but no, it is not a shuttle bay, not according to Doug.
If you look at the back of the secondary hull, yeah, there you go. So look at the back of the secondary hull, okay? Yeah. There's a little platform on the back with a couple of hangar bay doors. Okay?
This
that's
here?
Engineering. Yes, that's engineering staging area, basically. You could also use it to bring in supplies and things like that. But if you take out that center section, you pull out those pieces, there is a tunnel that goes to engineering. And the entire engineering department can slide out. And an entirely new one can be slid in. So that's something most people don't know.
You open that up, you could just slide out the entire engineering. You know when they eject the warp core, and you always think, oh, that looks very satisfying, coming out in a big tube from the bottom of the ship. That, but for the entire engineering bay. I like that, although it would presumably just crash into the pod. Similar to this, there are 4 large hatches on the ship that were designed to open up and just be fly-through space for little worker bees or smaller craft. The idea being that they could then load the ship up with everything they needed in zero gravity instead of having to do it far harder in a gravity-based environment. Again, no story about this on the show because admittedly, it does rob some tension, although ejecting the entire engineering department would have been fun. Number 2, Refuture. Now, of course, Enterprise ended at the end of the 4th season with We Are the Voyagers, and here on TrekCulture we never, ever, ever like to talk about that episode if we can help it, but the Enterprise did get new life, let's say, 6 years later when it debuted on the ships of the line calendar, or at least the SS Enterprise did anyway, and it looked like this. Now again, if you like me saw that and thought, oh, that was a cool idea, they should have done that in the show, well, that was the plan from the start, apparently.
If you look at the NX, the proportions are almost the same as the 1701, because the idea is that it's growing towards that design. When I was designing it, I was taking a secondary. We knew we would make it more primitive by just having the saucer and the nacelles, and that they would eventually build up to an engineering section. Plug it up. Look, everything on Star Trek is like that. Look at the phaser. It's got the pistol phaser. The hand phaser goes on the top. The battery pack goes on the bottom. The Enterprise was the same way.
Yeah.
It was modular. And so that was the idea so while I was designing it, I was taking a secondary hull and placing it underneath and adjusting the symmetry of it to work with a secondary hull from day one.
And quite interestingly, Doug says that once people found out about this plan, that it was all supposed to build towards a more complete ship, it really did reframe the design of the NX-01 in the minds of a lot of fans. Like, the guy got heat for the look of the thing when it first came out. People were like, wow, that's a pretty ugly starship you got there. Guess I won't be watching your show. But once they found out about the plan and how Star Trek it was going to look and how it was all building towards that, and that, if anything, was the entire premise of the show when you think about it, people love it now. I don't hate the NX-01. It looks lovely, and knowing that it was gonna look like that makes it even lovelier. Number one, you gotta try this pole. All right, here, the main event. The main event is a pole, right? And I'll tell you why. Normally when we dig up these articles, when Paul or me or Marcus, whoever, goes through all the facts and tries to find something about these ships that we didn't know, admittedly, you can't find 10 things that nobody knew. We always get people in the comments being like, oh, I knew that one, or I knew that one. And to be honest, we knew some of them as well. It's just that, the majority of people tend not to know all these things. So right here, right now, secrets of the NX-01 Enterprise, number one is something that I promise you that you didn't know. Because I didn't know it, because none of us knew it, because nobody knew it. The only person who knew it is Doug, and Doug told us.
You know that when you're on the bridge, to either side of the main viewing screen, there's a door. And the idea is that if you go out that door, there's a dark gallery that runs around the bridge on either side. Circular gallery that has windows. Those windows you see on the bridge, that's where they are. And there's a gallery. Now, if you go outside those doors, there's a fireman's pole that you could slide down to go to engineering.
Okay.
You could jump on that pole and go straight down. Why wouldn't you?
Yeah. I mean, that's always been kind of a funny thing about Federation ships is everybody takes an elevator everywhere. Nobody takes stairs or ladders for the most part, unless they really have to.
Firemen have firemen's poles for a reason. It's not just because it's fun. Whee! Ride the pole down. Because you're down there instantly. And if you look at the cutaway, engineering is like a deck below them and aft a little bit. So you jump on that fireman's pole and you go down. I wish we could have shown that. That'd be awesome.
Yeah, there is a pole. There is a pole on the Enterprise NX-01 that you can slide down to go to engineering, because they thought that would be really, really cool and it would just look awesome. And I can't believe they didn't use that in the show. Like, we occasionally get to see just a little bit around the corner of the bridge and stuff like that, but they never showed us the pole. And the idea was that firemen use these poles for a reason, because they're quick and they're convenient, and engineering is just below the bridge. So why on earth would you not have a pole that you could just slide down and go? That's such a good idea. Doug, you absolute stone cold legend for including that in the design of the ship. We are furious with every single 2-bit writer that decided every single week, not going to do the poll, not going to do the poll, I'm not going to bother with the poll, we've got other stuff, the poll is not necessary. Let me tell you, lads, the poll was always necessary. In fact, the poll is so necessary, I'm debating renaming this series from the Dolphin series to the Poll series, because the poll is just so... You could think of all the fun possibilities you could have to poll on a poll, which is funny when you say it in a certain way. I despair.
I really enjoyed talking to you. I regret that we didn't reach out to you about Deep Space Nine or about, a number of the other articles that we've done. I hope that we can do this again, talk about, I have no idea what now, but, there's got to be something.
It's one of my favorite things to to blab about since 1966. So
Great, love it. Yeah, well, I really appreciate it, Doug.
It's great to meet you.
Yeah, you too. Take care.
10 Secrets of the USS Enterprise, 1701, you need to know. Number 10, it was originally upside down. Right, so Star Trek gets its commission, it gets its pilot, and Gene Roddenberry gets all his pals together to write the stories, to create the characters, to do all the little bits and bobs, and he gets Matt Jeffries, this man. I hope we've got a photo, we might not, I don't know. Anyway, his job was to design the ship they would go on these intrepid voyages on. The only brief he got was, I want it to look like it could easily accommodate 100 to 150 people. That was it. And to be fair, with just that scant guidance, he managed to come up with the Enterprise we all know and love today. But it was very nearly not quite what we have now. Basically, he took the model that he had created of the ship into a meeting with Gene and all the network types and showed it off. But, because it was so top heavy because of the saucer section, it fell off the table and landed upside down. And Gene Roddenberry went, I actually like that. So for an unspecified amount of time, the design of the Enterprise was this. Just literally the Enterprise, but with the saucer and the cells on the bottom and the hull and the thing all in the middle. It was gonna look like that, which is, come on now, it's really, really bad. Thankfully, Jeffries, he did fight his corner. He wouldn't let it go. He told him it had to be the right way up, and voila, so it was. Number 9, the Enterprise had 2 captains before Kirk took command. Alright, now everybody knows about Captain Christopher Pike, even if you didn't know about the original pilot and then how he got brought back into the show. The Abrams movies made a big song and dance about him before, well, gunning him down quite dramatically. But anyway, he was the original captain before Kirk. There's entire stories written about this fact. But what a lot of people don't know, and you're not going to get a prize for getting in the comments being like, oh, I knew about Robert April, everyone knows about... Who doesn't know about Robert April? There's no prizes for being that person, because a lot of people don't actually know about Robert April. He was the original captain of the Enterprise, and just... that's a point, actually. Not a lot of people actually know about Robert April. Some brave, intrepid, handsome even YouTuber should do a video on Robert April. Anyway, yes, the only appearance we've ever had of April has been in the animated series. He oversaw the design and the conception and all the maiden voyages of the ship, with Pike serving on board occasionally as first officer, and that is how the ship started its life as member of Starfleet, as a thing in Starfleet. Actually, while we're on the subject of Pike being first officer, there was also another first officer, but more on that in a little bit. Number 8, she was almost stolen by Klingons during her first mission. Alright, so before Robert April took command, there was somebody else who sat in the captain's chair, though not officially as captain, and that was Admiral Rasmussen. No, really. He was in charge of taking the Enterprise on its shakedown voyage, which, as you all know from Star Trek Generations, is just a standard thing that new ships go on to make sure everything's working and nothing ever goes wrong and hundreds of people don't die and Captain Kirk doesn't get sucked into the Nexus and ends up coming back to haunt Starfleet like 80 years later when a madman starts launching missiles into suns and blowing up planets and stuff. It's fine. Anyway, during this particular shakedown of the original Enterprise, 3 Klingons managed to sneak on board posing as Starfleet cadets somehow, and they take it over, attempting to steal it for the Empire. They cut all the power, they mess with the systems, the thing is cut adrift, it is floating in space, it is derelict until a Klingon battle cruiser with a winky eye and a tractor beam turns up with bad intentions. Admiral Rasmussen, though ever the diligent fellow, he gets himself into a shuttlecraft and he just rams it into the Klingon battle cruiser so it cannot steal the ship, and then is later found by the Federation, took back into space, etc. He's the hero, he saves the day, but it was very, very nearly stolen on its first day out. Number 7, the Enterprise's bridge was angled to the port side. Alright, so if you watch the show, you probably imagine that the way Kirk sits is facing directly forward, because that's how you would sit in literally anything that travels. Also, the view screen is there, so you just think that's the way they're going. But no, they were actually kind of like that. They were just slightly off. Now, there are 2 connecting reasons why this is the case, and neither of them are particularly good. But anyway, when they designed the set of the bridge, they wanted the turbo lift to be behind the captain's chair, but they didn't want William Shatner to have to do a total 180 in order to see any characters coming out of it. They just wanted him to have to turn a little bit. But when they designed the exterior of the hull, the little swollen out knobbly bit, which denotes where the turbo lift is dead center on the back of the bridge, meaning that if you walk out of that, you are facing directly forward. Whereas, of course, if you do walk out of that, you are not facing directly forward on the bridge, you'll be facing slightly off at an angle, which means the entire bridge is rotated ever so slightly because the two design departments didn't have one phone call. All they would have had to do is just literally, hello, yep, we're just going to put the turbo lift at an angle, can you just move that around on the outside a bit? Yep, no problem. Whole thing could have been avoided. Number 6, the Enterprise's self-destruct code. Now, Star Trek loves to do one thing in one episode and another thing in another, then a different thing in the film, and then refer to it all back as a completely separate thing entirely later on. They're very bad at small bits of consistency, but one thing they did get absolutely spot on and stuck with it was the self-destruct code of the Enterprise. In order to blow up the ship, you need to enter 3 separate command codes from 3 separate senior officers, and they kept that code consistent throughout both the TV series and the movie. See, it starts with Destruct Sequence 1, Code 1, 1A.
Destruct Sequence 2, Code 1, 1A, 2B.
Destruct Sequence Code 3, 1B, 2B. 3.
And then kaboom! Etc, etc, etc. Yes, in the original series episode, Let This Be Your Last Battlefield, as well, of course, as The Search for Spock, they are both entered consistently and correctly, albeit it isn't used the first time, but it is the second. Number 5, the Enterprise became self-aware moments before her destruction. Yeah, while we're on the subject of this, when they actually blew up the Enterprise over the Genesis planet, it both knew what was going on and felt it, which is awful. Now you remember he activates the auto-destruct sequence in order to outmaneuver these Klingons. They swap ships, they get them on there, they blow up, and then it crashes on the planet. My God, Bones, what have I done? The same thing you always do, Jim. Turn death into a fighting chance for life, etc, etc. But according to the short story Countdown, the Enterprise, which has had all manner of computer changes and was a mishmash of wires and systems and all of this, actually attained sentience minutes before it was destroyed. It realized what it was, what was going on, and what was about to happen. And this all just takes place in the last 10 seconds of that auto-destruct sequence. Something trips or something changes or something happens, and the Enterprise realizes that it is about to be destroyed. It remembers its time in service and decides that rather than cancelling its own self-destruct sequence and living on for a bit longer, it is privileged to be dying in battle, saving its crew, rather than simply just being decommissioned, as had been talked about. And to be fair, for a 200, 300 long piece of metal, that is a very, very noble way to go out. Like, I had a car once that just completely crapped out on me in the middle of the road, and that was it. I could have really used that kind of attitude then. Number 4, James Kirk's father, George, was the first officer. Now, weirdly, despite getting all of his screen time in the Kelvin universe played by actually Thor here, he's a far bigger character in the Prime universe than he is over there. Now, as you all know, he was first officer aboard the USS Kelvin at the start of that film, but had he not been blown into a million teeny tiny, very sad pieces in that film, he would have gone on to have a distinguished Starfleet career all of his own, including serving as first officer aboard the USS Enterprise. Now, alright, admittedly, yes, it is only for one mission, but that is one mission more than either you or I will ever serve as the Enterprise's first officer, and it was called the Rosen something operation, in which the ship, fresh out of space dock, has to go save a civilian ship from an ion storm. Rosenberg! I was right first time. Yet with time of the essence, Captain Robert April assembles just literally anybody he can get his hands on to form a skeleton crew to rush into the Romulan neutral zone in order to save that ship. Unfortunately for George Kirk this time round, they don't encounter a single really angry time-traveling Romulan. Number 3, Kirk repeatedly stole the Enterprise. Yes, Kirk might not have been the first captain of the Enterprise, but he was damn sure gonna make sure that he was the last. Now in the canon somewhere, Kirk is removed from the Enterprise and assigned to this covert Klingon mission, and Captain Zarlo is given command in his stead. But when Kirk was missing on this mission, the entire crew threatens to mutiny unless they abandon their current plans and go and rescue him, which is nice. Now, as you've all seen in the motion picture, Kirk is then bumped up to Admiral and recommends himself that Will Decker take his place. But then in that movie he goes, Starfleet, yeah, I'm going to change my mind on that one. Any chance you can just put me back on the Enterprise and I can have a run on the old girl? And they go, yes, of course. Then he gets in an argument with Decker, bumps him down to commander and makes him serve as first officer. What a dick. And then there was the time they made it a training vessel and put Spock in command of it. And of course, Kirk was like, oh, I thought you were going after the Genesis device. Well, how about you let old Jimmy here have a sit in the captain's chair one last time, buddy? And of course he did. And then he died on that mission, so bad move. And then, of course, best of all, after they retired the Enterprise from service, and pretty much the entire crew with it, they just steal it. They just go take it out of space dock to go and get Spock back. That's like my favourite scene in all of the original films. It's such a slow chase sequence. It's good though. Number 2, the Enterprise was a ship of Theseus. No, not that. That's with an F. This is Theseus with a TH. You mucky pups. Anyway, yes, a ship of Theseus is a philosophical question which basically says, if you have a ship and you change every single thing about it, the rod, the mast, the sails, the decking, every item, every single thing gets changed at some point during its service, is it still the same ship? Or, they did this much better on Only Fools and Horses once, if you have a mop with a head and a handle and you change them both 20 times, is that still the same mop? I mean, it's a philosophical question, so there isn't an actual answer to this, but obviously no, it's not the same ship. They changed the saucer and the hull and the nacelles and the warp core and the bridge and the torpedo bays and the crew quarters. What else is on a starship? The windows, everything. They changed it all like 100 times and it was still technically the Enterprise, but obviously it wasn't, because all the stuff from the first Enterprise is in a bin somewhere. I mean, that's all I've got for this. It's just an interesting thought experiment regarding that ship you like from a film. There you go. Number 1, almost a quarter of the crew died under Kirk's command. Yes, a 5-year mission, 430 crew members, and 94 of them did not make it home. That is like us launching TrekCulture, and within a few months, neither Zoe or Ewan ever being heard from again. I mean, I know we haven't used them in any videos or anything, so it is kind of like that, but you get the point. That is 4.4% of your entire crew dying every single year. If it's all at a consistent rate, then you have to stand around a torpedo looking really sad while someone blows a tin whistle every 19 days. Kirk got a promotion after that mission, a promotion. 10 secrets of that ship that you need to know, and, well, my name is Adam Cleary and that's the title. That was bad. Number 10, another used starship. Now, if you'd be so kind as to cast your mind back to us doing this exact video for the Enterprise E, you will know that a small discrepancy in the plot, namely that it appears that they somehow made that ship in about 5 seconds after the destruction of the Enterprise D, was simply solved by pointing out the ship already existed under another name. It was just, when they needed it, it was rechristened Enterprise. And one little wrinkle in the history of the Enterprise A, which is of course the rebuild of the ship after it is destroyed in the search for Spock, is that it was already in existence. It was another refit Constitution class that just happened to be zipping around the galaxy, called the USS Yorktown. That's why in Star Trek 4, when Kirk's log says that it's only been like 3 or 4 months since the events of the last film, meaning that they had to whip that ship up really quickly in order for it to be pressed into service, that doesn't make sense. They didn't. It was already built. It was already doing Star Trek stuff. It's just that they renamed it. Now, this has happened lots in Star Trek. Happened with the Enterprise E, of course, happened with the Defiant. That was the Sao Paulo for a long time. I don't know why I said that like James Brown, but I did anyway. That was the Sao Paulo for years before it was the actual Defiant. So, not uncommon this, but interesting. Oh, and just worth quickly pointing out, there is actually a non-canon reference to this in Mr. Scott's Guide to the Enterprise, which is the exact same story, except it was called the Tai-Ho, which is not as good a name as the Yorktown. I think if I was a captain, it would be of the Yorktown. That's another story. Number 9, Universal Studios ruined the paint. Okay, so for the Enterprise's first appearance on the big screen in the motion picture, a genius paint scheme was devised for it. It was going to be a series of interlocking panels called Aztec patterning. It was all going to be coloured in by this brilliant airbrush artist called Susanna Swansea. It looked absolutely stunning. Metallic paint, a big gloss, a sheen. It was genuinely going to be one of the most eye-catching things ever committed to cinema. Like, this thing would reflect different colours depending on the intensity or the angle of the light being shined on it. That, like in real life as well, not a visual effect. That's how they built it. That's what it was supposed to do. And of course, nobody actually thought about the implications of filming this, and when they got it under studio lights, the VFX team were like, wow, that's really reflective and makes everything an absolute nightmare. So most of the shots in the first couple of films are done in incredibly low light, which means means you can't see any of the detail or the patterning on it. It gets worse though, because after the filming of Star Trek IV, Paramount then loaned the model of the ship to Universal Studios for their big Star Trek attraction thing, and because they had to shoot some extra shots for that, they looked at it and thought, oh, that's going to be quite complicated. What with the sheen on it? So they painted the whole thing grey. Just one big thick coat of grey paint. And when they gave it back, they went to go film The Final Frontier, and someone was like, oh, do you know this is it's covered in grey paint, this. So they had to then fix all of that, even under the incredible time constraints of the film anyway. So it's just, you know what, the lesson here is just never try. Number 8, the bridge changed every film. Chris, can we get some, how do I put this? Comical elevator music, please. Yep, thank you, that'll do. So this was the bridge in the motion picture. This was the bridge in The Wrath of Khan. This was the bridge in The Search for Spock. This was the bridge in The Voyage Home. This was the bridge in The Final Frontier. And this was the bridge in The Undiscovered Country. Haha! Anyway, interesting story. The final 2 images you saw there, where did they crop up in The Next Generation? Because we love the whole Paramount used the sets for loads of different things. We love that. That's our gimmick here. Where have you seen that before? It's the Battle Bridge and Data's Science Lab. Oh, it doesn't just stop there, though. It was the bridge for the Enterprise B and the Amargosa Observatory in Star Trek Generations. So, just honestly, the money Paramount could squeeze out of a Star Trek set is incredible. Number 7, damage between films. Got a little fact for you here, accompanied by 2 very different reasons for that fact, one of which is incredibly boring and practical, the other is grounded in some sort of canon lore. Alright, so at the end of Star Trek 2, this is the amount of damage that is seen on the Enterprise, because they got into that fight with the Reliant and pew pew pew, one big fleet, oh, they took us out with one shot, they knew exactly where to hit us. You've seen the film, etc, etc. Now, in Star Trek 3, the damage looks like this. That is more damage. So there's entire areas of that ship that have just been hit and battered that weren't hit or battered in the film. So what happened there? Well, the boring answer is that the producers looked at it and thought, actually, you know what? Given how big and catastrophic that fight was, it doesn't look beat up enough, so let's just beat it up a bit more so when it's going into space dock, we get more of a feel for the battle. That's the boring answer. The slightly canon answer, in that it's not actually canon at all, never mind, is that we know they must have made at least one stop off between those films, because where is David? Where is Carol? Where is Savick? Where is the entire rest of that trainee crew? They certainly weren't in the start of the 3rd film, so we know they must have stopped somewhere and done something, so we can then assume that when they stopped somewhere and did something, they had a little fight. That's all I've got. I don't know, maybe the damage was so bad that it continued to burn and degrade or something for days after the fight was finished. Look, just make up your own answer here. Number 6, the only toilet in the fleet. Alright, here you go, possibly my favourite fact we have ever done. Star Trek V was not a good film. The effects were all over the place. The 3rd act just fell off a goddamn cliff, but it does include perhaps one of the most important moments in all of Star Trek history. While Kirk and Spock are in the brig, and Kirk learns that Sybok is his half-brother, he is so overcome with emotion that he is forced to sit down. Freeze it! That seat that Captain Kirk takes in this moment is the only toilet ever seen in Star Trek. It is blink and you miss it stuff, and yes, he does not immediately drop trow and prove that it works, but that is still the only toilet ever seen in Star Trek. Some are hinted at, yes, others are maybe even mentioned in passing, I will grant you, but that is it. That is it, the one and only in space. Number 5, the amber deflector dish. Deflector dish, always quite a fascinating thing, given how inconsistently and just MacGuffin-y it is in Star Trek, but there was a really interesting wrinkle in the motion picture about it, which never got repeated anywhere else. So bottom line here, the model they used in the original Star Trek series was not well built, it was not elaborate, it was not complex, it wasn't even very expensive, but by the time they came to make the films, 2001 had happened and people expected a certain level of just depth and visual impressiveness, out of ship models. So when they designed the Enterprise, they had money to spend, they had money to burn, and they went back to all of Gene Roddenberry's original ideas and started to put them into practice. He wanted lights on the outside of the ship to illuminate the name, he wanted lights in the nacelles to make them look alive and glowing, but also he wanted a deflector dish that did things. It wasn't just a copper big gold thing stuck on the front, he wanted it to do things to feel like a part of the ship. So for the motion picture, it started as quite a dull thing, then it would move into a copper amber sort of thing, then finally it would glow brightly when the ship was at warp. And the reason for this was it was supposed to represent how much power the ship was using at the time. Quite why the deflector dish needed to show how much power the ship was using at the time, you could just have a little display on someone's computer, you would imagine, I don't know, but either way, that's what they wanted it for. So when it was at warp, it was glowing. But again, given how inconsistently the deflector dish is used, they just binned this off from the Wrath of Khan onwards, and it was just kind of used with nice little lights and glow-up effects and whatnot, but nothing that ever really meant anything. But for the motion picture only, its lights had a purpose, which is, I like it. Again, do you remember when we did the Enterprise E version of this, and there was like this little funny inconsistency with how many decks it was? Like somebody says 23, and someone says 26, and someone says 27. It's all kind of like, it's roughly the same amount of decks, isn't it? But I just can't quite seem to agree how many there is. Right, now take that, and now make it stupid. Make it Shatner. Every single technical manual or piece of kit or whatever always describes the Enterprise refit as between 21 and 23 decks tall. It's pretty much around the same thing. You can always kind of co-op decks and stuff. You can believe that's a consistent thing across the life of that ship. But then, of course, we got to Star Trek V, and they just gave the pen to old Bill Shatner and left the room. Anyway, in this film, there is a moment where Kirk, Spock, and McCoy escape Cyborg's henchmen by using a pair of gravity boots to rise the entire height of the ship. Now, putting aside the fact that you can't actually draw a straight line here from the bottom of the secondary hull to the top of the saucer section, let's just forget that for a second. You want to know how many decks they go through? So they go up and up and up, and they go past a sign for deck 13. Fine, that's all right. Then deck 52, a bit weird. Then deck 52 again, really weird that. Then finally they come to a stop at deck 78. Now, two options here. Either the turbo lift shaft was out of order precisely because somebody desperately needed to repaint all of those signs, or more likely, as I've said, William Shatner. Number 3, coming to the Enterprise A. Really, really short one, this, just because you know how we like to talk about reuse sets and stuff and say, oh, they had it for this, they had it for that. This is even better. So Star Trek V, they wanted to show the shuttle bay all big and stuff, but they didn't have a set that was big enough to show the bigness of the shuttle bay. But thankfully, Eddie Murphy's Coming to America had just finished filming on a nearby lot, and they let them have the Royal Palace. Yep, they turned that into the Enterprise shuttle bay. Why not? Number 2, off-the-shelf Enterprise. Another quite quick one, this. You know how they build several models for the various different shots they need? Like there's a big one and a little one for close-ups and stuff, and they have varying levels of detail and varying levels of lighting. Basically, in order to get the practical VFX shots back then, they needed several different scale models in order to properly capture the thing at certain distances and certain whatever. They needed lots of different models, right? Well, these models are all very expensively constructed, and they're all built in these proper big warehouses by these companies that make these beautiful scale cinematic models, right? All of them, right? Just to let you know the kind of thing I'm talking about here, there was a 48-inch scale model of just the neck of the ship that was used just for the shots of the Reliant pulverizing it in the Wrath of Khan. That's the kind of deal they go to here. No expense spared. They build really big, elaborate things unless they're in a pinch. When they are in a pinch, like they were for Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country, they just need one shot of it, just like about that big. They need a model about that big, just so when the Excelsior arrives, it's something that's like a nice medium distance away, and it just doesn't need to be an expensive one. It can't be a big one because it's got to be at the right scale. And they just didn't quite have a model that was small enough for this shot. But thankfully, at the time, the USS Enterprise was the best-selling scale model replica kit you could buy in any hobby shop. So guess what they did? This shot right here in the Excelsior's view screen as it arrives at the Battle of Kittimer, that is not an expensively constructed Enterprise model. That is an off-the-shelf replica kit that your kids or you, I don't know, could hang up in your bedroom off the ceiling. That's all that is. It was like $8 or something. Number 1, the Enterprise A lives on. Now, we tend not to get too far into, how do I put this, spurious non-canon source material, but the Enterprise A did have some really good ones, which I don't think hurt anybody by thinking of as fact. Basically, there was loads of tie-in novels all the way through the movies, which were canon and then weren't canon and were erased and brought back and all that, etc., etc. You know the drill with these kind of things, but a couple of them should probably hang around. Specifically, I like the very last voyage of the ship, because of course, after the undiscovered country, it flies off. Do you fly in space? Zooms off, warps off into the sunset. Can the sun set in space? I've lost my train of thought here. It leaves. That was the last we see of it on screen, but in the tie-in novel Ashes of Eden, it was then decommissioned and sold to an alien race called the Shal as part of their defense fleet. Basically, it was an old, decrepit starship, so they sold it on for resources or whatever, and it got another run as an old, clapped out, but nonetheless advanced for the people now running it, spaceship. And because you can't keep a good captain down, Kirk left Starfleet, went to work with the Shal to help them fight off a load of Klingons, and he brought Scotty along with him, so one last time he got to fight the Klingons as the captain of the Enterprise, and lo and behold, it was blowed up. 10 secrets about the Enterprise D you will not believe. Number 10, the Calypso. So, you remember Star Trek Insurrection? Yes, I know that was the Enterprise E. You remember in the midst of the watery plot and hokey action sequences, there was the captain's yacht. And you remember how you thought, well, do you know what? That's actually quite a good little plot device, that. They should have had that in the Next Generation. Well, they did! Yep, the Enterprise D did have one. It was just never included in the show. Basically, on the underside of the saucer section, like opposite to where the main bridge is, Captain Picard had his own personal yacht for diplomatic missions, fun adventures out, or just, I don't know, going on an archaeological dig and getting into a really cerebral, short-term relationship with a very intellectual woman. That was like his thing, wasn't it? It did occasionally creep into the show, though. It was included on Master System displays, and when asked about it, Patrick Stewart himself said he would have called it the Calypso. So, there you go. Number 9, it was incredibly empty. Alright, so there is on YouTube an insanely good video by a one E.C. Henry that basically proves that the Enterprise D was virtually a ghost ship. Taking the published schematics of the vessel, which listed it as 642.5 meters long, and holding a crew of just over 1,000 people, he worked out precisely how much of the ship was actually being used at any one time. On a ship with over 800,000 square meters, that gives each person on board almost 850 square meters to themselves. That is insane. For comparative purposes, the largest military vessels of today have about 1/10 that sort of size, with well over 6 times the number of people on board. You could quite easily and quite conceivably spend all day walking around the ship attending to your various duties and not see one single other person. In fact, the amount of people on the ship means the accommodation required to store them accounted for only 4% of the actual vessel. That is 96% of the ship when everybody's in bed, just not being used. Yes, I know not everyone would be in bed. It's an example. The show actually kind of does support this theory, because compared to the original series, the corridors are just very sparsely populated. Like, you never see people just bumping into each other from going one place to another. In fact, the only places you do see a lot of people are communal areas like 10 Forward, where everybody would naturally congregate. Number 8, it nearly didn't exist at all. Yeah, it's almost impossible to imagine any Star Trek series not taking place on some kind of iconic spacefaring vessel, but the original designs, the original plans for the Next Generation did not have the Enterprise in it at all. You see, worried about the reaction a new Enterprise would get if it didn't live up to the original, producers discussed a number of options, including just not having it at all, like setting it 200 years after the original series, with such giant strides taken in transporter technology that you didn't need starships anymore. The crew would just have a little base and go on mission from there. Thankfully, this idea was scrapped quite early on, and they set about designing the USS Enterprise NCC 17017 until the movie started calling it the NCC 1701A, so they changed it to the NCC 1701G, and then reined it back a bit and called it the NCC 1701D. There you go. Number 7, you never actually saw the main shuttle bay. Rarely depicted in the show for budgetary reasons, and you're gonna be hearing a lot of that in the rest of the video. The shuttle bays on the Enterprise were small but functional, you'd say. They were kind of like little cargo bays where you had one or two things in. However, according to the official design schematics drawn drawn by Rick Sternbach, a man responsible for loads of props on the show. The main shuttle bay was absolutely massive. It was like half as wide as like the middle chunk of the saucer section. It spanned 3 decks. It was home at any one time to over 24 craft. Not only that, but there were a number of refueling areas, repair stations, cargo storage things, and a tower that was 3 decks high. Now, of course, building a practical set of this was deemed way too expensive, but Stage 9 did do a visual rendering of this, and it looks absolutely glorious. Now, I would love to direct you to Stage 9's rendering of the whole Enterprise D, because it was absolutely glorious, but CBS shut them down for copyright and a pox on their house, in my opinion. Number 6, there were dead bodies in the warp nacelles. In the year 2363, the USS Enterprise D launched from the Utopia Planitia shipyards to begin its never-ending mission to chart the galaxy and get involved in all kinds of adventures. But in 2370, they discovered that the warp nacelles had actually been the site of a double murder-suicide before they even left space dock. That would have been, you imagine, quite awkward. In the Season 7 episode, Eye of the Beholder, it's revealed that Walter Pierce, one of the construction team, killed 2 of his fellow officers in the midst of some seedy love triangle. The victims, Marla Finn and William Hodges, were cleverly disposed of in the plasma stream, with Pierce then committing suicide the same way. Their remains weren't discovered for over 8 years. However, with Pierce having a Betazoid grandparent, this left a telepathic imprint in the bulkhead, which would later compel other crew members, who were telepathically sensitive, to throw themselves into the plasma stream the same way, and in one case, actually caused Deanna Troi to have such a powerful hallucination that she went completely mad and killed Worf, sort of, in the process. Number 5, it was full of catch. The most advanced ship in the fleet, humanity's greatest technical marvel at this point in its history, the USS Enterprise D was irrefutably, undeniably full of catch. Top to tail, stern to stem, front to back, inside and out, the entire thing just caked in feline blasting powder, and I'm not even making this up. But don't worry though, this isn't some weird bottle episode you've missed where Spot decides to mutiny on the crew, and instead of just sharpening his claws on all the soft furnishings around the warp core, enacts a dirty protest in 10 Forward. Instead, this is real life. You see, the soundstage that was used for The Next Generation was home to packs of feral cats, and whenever they would leave between seasons, they would just get infested with the things again, and when they came back, they had just curled loads of cat poos out on all the nice carpets. See, humanity, we can conquer the entirely non-trivial challenge of intergalactic spaceflight, but we can't stop Tiddles from going on the floor. Number 4, the computer core was huge. If there is one thing I want you to take from this video, right, it's that Captain Picard's ultimate adversary was not the Borg, it was not the Romulans, it wasn't even Q, it was the men at the studio who held the purse strings while all the creative minds behind the show battled to try and get some more money out of them. So much about this ship never saw the light of day because it cost too much. One thing they absolutely tried their best with was the enormous scale of the computer core that helped power the ship. There was 3 of them on the thing, in fact, and while it is officially canon, it's in all the schematics, it's talked about on the show, it's even shown in part, it was never realized in the scale it was supposed to be. The best we got was these tiny little rooms where you could go in and access the computer core, but you never saw the actual computer core. Original designs had the thing spanning entire decks, with crews zipping around on little floating platforms to try and work various terminals on it, not unlike the human brain in the very cute movie Inside Out. We're supposed to get that, and we got that. Boo. Number 3, the recreation areas. Now, as we have already covered, the Enterprise was an inordinately large ship with an inordinately sparse crew, so part of the idea behind that was you would have everybody spread out all the time doing their jobs with these little areas where they would congregate in groups to remain social. Now, in the show itself, this manifested as 10 Forward, where every single person would go to either solve the problems of intergalactic social political war or just talk about the girl that they really fancied. That was in the show, but there was also 2 Forward, 9 Forward, and loads of smaller breakout areas they were supposed to use in filming. Now, the show's budget would not stretch to the other bar areas, and in truth, there was narratively no reason for them once you'd established 10 Forward, but in the first season, they did try to bring these smaller breakout areas by, like, redressing other areas of the sets to make it look like people were just chilling out in little groups, but they binned that off after season 1 because they were pointless. That said, though, the 5-deck-high mall area they were supposed to have, not unlike the promenade in Deep Space Nine, would have made for some very, very interesting creative choices. Number 2, it was originally designed for Kirk. Yeah, the design of the Galaxy-class starship wasn't just pulled out of somebody's arse at the last minute. It had existed for years and years and years and years. In fact, it was originally conceived of during the fallout of the whole Star Trek Phase 2 thing. Now, if you don't know what that is definitely the subject for another video. It was this abortive attempt in the 1970s to revive Star Trek as a TV show, but in a different direction with all new things, and some of the ideas in it were so good that they've gradually been getting milked out for years and years later. The actual original design of the USS Discovery, that was for Phase 2. Now, the story goes that one of the designers on the project, Andrew Probert, left after it all fell apart and, frustrated with the constraints put on him, designed a version of the Enterprise that he would have made if he'd been allowed to just break all the rules he was given by the production team. It had to look so much like the original Enterprise, but he didn't want to do that. He wanted to make it look like, well, this. So he did a really nice painting of it and hung it in his office, and then when he got hired to work on the Next Generation pre-production, he took it with him to the new office and hung it somewhere that Gene Roddenberry saw it and went, "That's nice." Now, yes, while it was never actually intended to be commanded by James T. Kirk, the fact that the genesis of the idea, pun very much intended, originated from the original cast is nonetheless incredibly interesting. If it had gone through as Phase 2 and he had been allowed to design it however he wanted, we could have had Kirk, Spock, McCoy et al. In this version of the Enterprise, which is, as sliding doors moments go in Star Trek, that's a pair of sliding doors for you, quite interesting. Number 1, Cetacean Ops. Just need to get this sentence out in one concise go so that the unpacking of it doesn't dilute the actual impact of me just saying it, right? The USS Enterprise D had an entire department of the ship that was run, staffed, and commanded by dolphins. Not some dolphin-like Star Trek species called the Flipperanians or something like that. Actual, real-life dolphins that you have seen in a nature documentary, and I have dated at least 2 women with tattoos of. Actual dolphins, specifically 12 bottlenose and Pacific bottlenose dolphins, all under the command, and I can't believe I'm saying this, of 2 whales. The idea was that in a few hundred years we will have effective ways to communicate with these 2 very intelligent species, and their entire different approaches to science, to culture, to pretty much everything would make them invaluable members of a starship crew, specifically when it came to xenolinguistics, because they've got an entirely different language of their own, and complex 3-dimensional navigational issues, because they live in the sea. Curse the many gods of Western commerce that we never ever got to see this on television or in the movies, but it is definitely canon because Geordie LaForge actually asks somebody if they have got a chance to see the dolphins, and in yesterday's Enterprise a call goes out over the comm for a Dr. Joshua Kim to report to Cetacean Ops. So just once more, the USS Enterprise NCC 1701D had an entire department on board that was run, staffed and commanded by dolphins and whales and Dr. Joshua Kim. 10 more things about the Enterprise D you need to know. Number 10, we did see the main shuttle bay. Alright, so gonna open this by throwing my old hands up and saying, I might have got this one wrong. Number 7, you never actually saw the main shuttle bay. Yeah, gonna open this by holding my hands up and saying we got this one slightly wrong. I did say in the previous version of this video that you never actually got to see the Enterprise D's main shuttle bay in all of its glory because it was just designed too big and too grand and too interesting for them to ever realize on screen. Instead, we got the much smaller, much easier to visualize, much cheaper to produce shuttle bays. Never got to see the massive, enormous 2-story parking lot style shuttle bay they had right at the back of the saucer section. Except we did. Sort of. It was in the episode Cause and Effect. The USS Bozeman, you know, the repeating one where they keep playing the same card game and doing all the same stuff over and over because there's a time loop or something like that. The ship Fraser, doesn't he, comes out with the thing and he crashes into them and they all die. Apparently the idea they had to fix it in the end, the data has, is to decompress the main shuttle bay. There you go. And that is the main shuttle bay. That one prop shot of the outside of the doors opening, that is the main shuttle bay. So technically, you did see it, just not very well. Number 9, sickbay was actually massive. Given how much time they spent in sickbay and how much mortal peril the cast and crew were often in, you don't think it was weird that a ship with over 1,000 people on board had a sickbay with 5 beds? Like intergalactic plagues, diseases, people getting the flu, all sorts. 5 people could ever be staying in that sick bay at once. That not seem weird? Well, that's because it wasn't. It was absolutely massive according to the technical blueprints, and the part we saw was just one part of a much bigger sick bay facility, like a hospital you might call it. And if we could just bring up the blueprints here, it was actually this big specifically, which is comparative to what we saw on screen, genome. In fact, just going through the dialogue of the show alone, it tells you that there were 3 sick bay wards, surgical suites, medical labs, private hospital rooms, a rehabilitation center, and a morgue, which the really scary thing happens that time, as well as also a null G ward, which is like a medical treatment facility, but with 0 gravity, because for some reason that can help you. It just saves you putting your feet up if you sprain your ankle, I guess, but other than that. Number 8, the Arboretum. Alright, so one last thing I'm adding to the big long list of things that would have been very cool for them to have the budget to show us, yes, along with the giant computer core and of course cetacean ops and I guess the sick bay, is the Arboretum. Now you did see this, but we only saw a small, tiny fraction of it. It was absolutely massive. In fact, if you just take a look at the very back of the Enterprise D model, you see those 2 large blue square things. That is actually the Arboretum, meaning it's at least 2 decks tall. It's really, really wide and so much bigger than they ever actually used in the set of the show. I would love to have seen that, even if they just knocked it up in a very weird sort of background painting kind of way. That would have been interesting to me. A man with no garden. Wait, is that what an arboretum is? Just plants, isn't it? It is just plants. I live in a flat in a building. I can't go outside. Number 7, idiots broke into the ship. No, we're not talking about those Ferengi mercenaries. A hook. See, Paul, that's how good your jokes are. We're talking about some actual criminals. According to the Daily Dot, who were the ones who actually labeled them idiots, in 1988, some people actually broke into the set of the ship, had a lot of fun and games there, and even videoed themselves doing it. Hence, when the tape was recovered, they had all the evidence they needed to say it was hence idiots, basically. Don't video yourself doing a crime. It's pretty much... If I was doing a crime, pretty much job number 1 would be don't actively create evidence of yourself doing it where possible. I'm going to read this out because it's genuinely hilarious. The videos of the break-in appeared on YouTube in 2007. They have since obviously been taken down, called Stage 9 Interlopers. 2 men dressed in homemade Starfleet uniforms. Where was Sean that night? I would like an alibi. Toured the deck, empty sets of the Enterprise. They played with the consoles. They pretended to beam out the transporter pod. They got into the bio beds for some reason. Then they talked about stealing props before the video ends. And in the description, it was like, oh, we got caught and we got chased out by Paramount Security. Again, if I'm doing a crime, I'm not gonna make videos of me doing the crime. Of course, the interesting thing about this is if you cast your mind back to the first video, we did tell you that the set was actually covered in cats because of how many cats used to break in there. So, wonder if that was a consideration? Wonder if they stood in any of it? Number 6, 10 forward doesn't fit. Now, as you've probably seen in these videos or just used your own common sense brain to work out, a lot of the sets in Star Trek are redresses. They're supposed to be adaptable. They change from episode to episode, from show to show, from series to series. They've got to be used for many different things because they've only got so much space, but not 10 forward. That was supposed to tell so many deeply personal stories and be such a focal part of that show that they made a permanent set that never changed and looked really, really cool. And it did look really, really cool. The only problem with it was they had a very clear idea of how they wanted 10 forward to look, and that idea came after they had designed the Enterprise D. So they knew where they wanted it to be, they knew how they wanted it to fit in with the ship, they knew what they wanted it to look like on screen. But the problem is, none of those things actually line up with the outside design of the Enterprise D. What you see on screen does not fit on that model. In fact, much to the annoyance of the ship's designer, Andrew Probert, who literally sat them down and said, well, you can do what you want if you're designing a bar cafe thing, but it's got to fit within these parameters. The producers just went, nope. But then so popular was 10 forward that when they redesigned the model to be slightly better filmed on television, they tweaked the design of the saucer section so that you could fit it in. But the problem with that was they had so much footage of the old model, which only varied ever so slightly that people wouldn't even notice when watching it on television because they couldn't predict that we'd all have HD, portable, Blu-ray copies of it in future to pour over for our personal entertainment YouTube channels, that they use these interchangeably. So there's lots of shots in the episodes with 10 forward not fitting into the source section, and then shots where it does fit into the source section. It's what's known as, in French, l'inconsistency. Number 5, the models were very different. Okay, so this one is just astoundingly short-sighted. So, when they made the next generation, they secured the services of ILM, Industrial Light and Magic. Yes, the really famous ones who do all the things for everything, and they got them to produce loads and loads of shots of the Enterprise D. They got them to build it, they got them to film it, they got them to make it so it was very easy to repurpose. In fact, most of the shots you ever see of the Enterprise D were done in that original window. And you know exactly the ones, it's flying by the screen, the close-ups when they're doing the captain's log at the start, going into orbit, coming out of orbit, all the ones you saw over and over again, ILM made them and they just adapted them throughout the show. But the problem with doing a show that runs on for 5, for 6, for 7, for 8, for however many seasons, is that you need more than that. You need variety. You are writing new things to happen to your characters, and those new things happen to your ships, and you must be able to visualize that and not just use the same stock images over and over again. So they needed, midway through production, to have new footage. But the problem was they couldn't get ILM anymore, either budgetary or whatever. They had to go to other studios, and other studios found the ILM model very difficult to work with because obviously they had their own filming practices. They would prefer to make their own models. So by season 3, they decided that's what they were going to do. And that new model debuted in the episode The Defector, which is why it's one of the first episodes where there's just all of a sudden brand new clips of the Enterprise. But the problem was, it wasn't exactly like the other one. They'd made it stockier. They'd made the model only 4 foot, so it was much easier to film. They'd exaggerated some of the paneling. They'd done little things like including 10 forward in the actual layout of it. And it was, to most people, exactly the same. But to nerds like me, like you, it's quite different. And of course, things only got worse when they went to make Star Trek Generations because they got ILM back, and ILM were like, ooh, movie budget, let's make a brand new 6-foot model, check, and a really cool CGI version, check, and all 4 of these different versions of the Enterprise will be ever so slightly different, with little raised bits here and little pronounced bits there, and just, it's all a mess. It's all a mess. I mean, to most people, to normal people, you can't tell, but again, we ain't normal. Number 4, she was almost CGI. So here's a slightly weird fun fact. Star Trek The Next Generation went into pre-production around the same time as The Search for Spock was being made, and there was a lot of talk that they should just go and use the refit model of the original Enterprise for this series. I mean, it seems ridiculous now, but at the time you can understand that. Do we need, it's still Star Trek, we want things to be connected, why do we need a new ship? And the plan was they were going to use the visual technology they had at the time to just do a CGI version of it, so it would be much cheaper to produce for television. But they didn't do that. In the end, they decided it didn't look quite as good as they wanted it to. It didn't look anywhere near as good as models did. So if they were going to have to build a model for television, because they couldn't use that one that had been in the film, they might as well just design it from scratch. And then just a mere 7 years later, they finally actually did make a CGI version of the Enterprise D for Star Trek Generations. So it's a funny old game, and it's funny how life works. Number 3, she was blue. Right, so lighting is, I don't look like this. The version you're seeing me on, I don't really look like this. My skin tone is very different. It's the lighting, okay? I'm in a studio, I'm being lit from the front, the back is being lit as well. This is not how you would see me on the street. And the same is true of models they use to recreate starships in television shows. They are the result of lighting. Which is why if I asked you to tell me what colour the Enterprise D was, indeed what colour are most of the ships in Starfleet, you'd probably say it's like a grey silver, like a very neutral grey or silver, wouldn't you? You'd be wrong. They are actually duck egg blue. Genuinely. And the reason for this, and this is going to blow your mind slightly if you're not like 50 or 60, is because the way the original Enterprise used to come across on old televisions when it was originally broadcast was duck egg blue. Even though that was designed to be silver/grey, it actually came across as slightly blue on television. But they had the same thing when they're doing the set for Strange New Worlds, didn't they? They've got everything orange, even though we sort of think of it as red, because those sets were actually orange. It's just it came off as red on television. So the old Enterprise on the 60s TV show used to look blue, so they designed the Enterprise D to look blue. And yet, of course, irony upon irony upon irony, even though it was designed blue to look like the colour that the Enterprise was not in the 1960s, when they started putting that under studio lighting, it looked silver grey, the colour the Enterprise actually was under studio lighting, which is mad. And if you still don't believe me, go watch the end of Star Trek Generations, when the saucer section crashes into the planet and is lit for the first time not by space lights or anything like that, but by a natural, neutral sun. It is blue. It is unmistakably blue. Unmistakably a word? Unmistakably blue. It is blue. Number 2, they destroyed the bridge for real. Alright, so people kind of noticed that they upgraded the bridge for Generations. They added extra consoles on the side, they raised the seating up in the middle. The idea was you're supposed to not notice it had changed, and because you were seeing it on a big screen, just think, oh wow, is that what that really looked like all this time? But of course, people aren't stupid, and instead they sat there and went, oh, they've changed it. And while it was a slightly controversial change, because yes, you're not going to believe it, people saw something had changed on something they liked and they got really annoyed about it and started doing stuff, it's just that the internet wasn't as terrible as it is now, so it kind of gets forgotten about. The plan, of course, was to destroy that bridge, because they were going to destroy the ship. And they actually did need to completely clear it out, because the space that was being used for the Enterprise D bridge needed to be cleared out to be the set for Voyager's bridge on the Paramount lot. So rather than just making effects appear to destroy the place, they decided, well, let's actually trash it. So the fires, explosions, everything burning, everything collapsing on top of itself, none of that is practical work or effects or designed to be put away. They just started knocking stuff over and setting fire to it and kicking it around, and that's why it looks so good. Some of it was saved though, in case I've upset you by saying that. It's in the Hollywood Entertainment Thingy Museum. It's been there since like 2007. If you want to go see it and be like, oh, thank God, you're safe, horseshoe console, then it's there. Number 1, Future Enterprise had a naughty bumper sticker. So, really quick one to end on this, quite fun. You all saw All Good Things, one of my all-time favorite Star Trek Next Generation episodes, one of my all-time favorite Star Trek episodes, full stop. In fact, the Enterprise refit, the Galaxy X class, I think it's called. You know, it's got the third incredibly phallic warp nacelle on the back. It's got loads of shooty phases. It's got Old Man Riker behind the wheel. You remember it. It appears briefly, blows up some Klingons, and then goes to warp 13, and we just never addressed that again. You remember it, right? It had a funny bumper sticker. Now this information comes exclusive to you thanks to our good pal Doug Drexler, who you can either see in a forthcoming video that we've just done, or that's already gone out. I don't know when you're going to see this one, but we've done some fun stuff with him, is my point. He told us there was a bumper sticker on the physical model of that. They took one of the old models of the Enterprise D and they added stuff to it because it was the last episode. You can get away with stuff like that. They put a bumper sticker on it as well. Any guesses? Anyone? Anyone? What do the bumper stickers say? Anyone? Anyone? I heart Uranus. Wait, no, it's even funnier. We heart Uranus. Actually, according to this, the master display system on that also contained loads of funny Easter eggs. They had a biplane, a mouse, and a rubber ducky, all just based in the ship schematics. Because it was the last episode, it was the last day of school for everyone who worked on the Next Generation, so they started having some fun. 10 secrets about the USS Enterprise 1701E that you need to know. Number 10, the Enterprise Turk-E. Yeah, the design of the Enterprise E pretty much started the moment Generations finished. I think by 1995 they actually had some production sketches in the works. And unlike other ships we've seen in this series, the original concepts for it weren't massively wildly away from what we ended up getting, but the original sketch is still quite interesting. Eves, who was working on Deep Space Nine at the time, decided to take everything he liked about the original USS Enterprise and everything he liked about Voyager, put them together, and he came up with this. Now the main thing here is of course the forward swept pylons, that's what they originally changed, but like Voyager, they were designed to go up and down depending on when the ship was in warp and when it wasn't. This was obviously some narrative reason, because apparently the whole warp 5 limit Voyager got rid of that with the ups and down thing, but they never really actually made that a big deal on screen, but the original design did incorporate it. Also, the oval saucer section of the Enterprise D, he rotated so it gave the illusion of forward motion. Quite clever. Apparently they did pretty much all the work for First Contact with this design until Rick Berman took a look at it a few months before the film started and went, anyone else think this looks like a big turkey in a pan? And the entire production crew went, ah, yeah, it does. So they went back to the drawing board and they tweaked it to get rid of the whole turkey leg looking thing, which is actually a shame because when did First Contact come out? Anybody? Thanksgiving. So, would have worked. Number 9, Last Action Hero. Now, as was the style at the time, Industrial Light and Magic constructed a 10-foot scale model of the ship for all of the effects work. Because you got to remember, this was the 90s. Like visual effects, the computer stuff, that was done a little bit here and there because it was expensive and didn't actually look that good. So they did pretty much everything with a physical model. But that did not last. And indeed, by the time the film came to being made, advancements in visual effects meant that actually they could do a lot of stuff on computer rather than with the physical model. So they did still use it for the outside shots of them all walking on the hull and some bits and pieces here and there, but by and large, a lot of the more dynamic shots of the ship in that film are done on a computer. And indeed, such was the rapid advancement of this technology that the CGI Enterprise was pretty much all you saw in both Insurrection and Nemesis. So the 10-foot model was made and then hardly used, and I want to know if I can have it. If anyone, don't know, if you're out there and you work for Industrial Light and Magic and you've got a 10-foot Enterprise E in your garage somewhere, I'll take it. I'll hang it out the window. Number 8, 24 decks. Or not. Yeah, not that we like to pull out mistakes in all of this, but it is kind of interesting that the production crew never fully settled on how many decks the Enterprise E actually had. So in First Contact, Picard tells Lily that there are 24 decks on the Enterprise E. It's also 700 meters long, etc, etc, etc. So, oh cool, the captain will know how many decks are on his ship, and there are 24 of them. And then later there's a big graphic which only shows 23 decks on the ship. So maybe he was close, but he got it slightly off by 1. And then later on, Worf's like, yes, the Borg have assimilated from deck 26 up. And it's like, oh, does anybody know how many decks there actually are? Then, to make matters worse, in Star Trek Nemesis, there is a line of dialogue saying that they've lost shields on deck 29 and that the Remans have beamed over to board on that deck. 29 now. And then, just to make matters even worse, Riker goes down to deck 29 to fight the Remans, and when he kills one of them, he throws them off a thing and they plummet several more decks. So there's at least 29, there's possibly like 35 with an infinite chasm, but according to Picard, there's 24, and on the visuals there's 23, but the Borg are on 26, and just make your fucking minds up, man. Number 7, a ship by any other name. Bit of a wrinkle in the timeline, lol, not like Star Trek to do that, is in First Contact, Geordi says that they have been in space for a year now doing their shakedown cruise. Now, First Contact takes place 2 years after Generation, so that leaves like at most an entire year to design, build, construct, and launch that ship. And when you look at it, that seems a very short amount of time because there's a lot going on there. But in a 1998 AOL chat room, and that is a thing I'm old enough to remember, Ronald D. Moore cleared that up by saying while it didn't make it into the film, there was a bit of canon in the background of this that says that the ship had actually been in design and construction for years before the Enterprise D was destroyed. It was just not going to be the next Enterprise. Basically, they were already designing the Sovereign class ship. We're probably going to launch it as the USS Sovereign, but then, of course, when the Enterprise was destroyed, they thought, oh, we'll just make that the flagship instead. Now, there is actually precedent for this. The US Navy, when the Yorktown was sunk at Midway, just renamed a new ship the Yorktown because it was launching about the same time. So this does happen in real life, so I suppose it can happen in Star Trek. Further interesting point, Gene Roddenberry actually said the same thing had happened to the Enterprise A, and that was called the Yorktown originally, so full circle. Great Eagle, Galaxy, whatever it is. Number 6, a last dish effort. Yes, shout out to Junkball Media who somehow sleuthed this one out. If you look at this picture of the Enterprise E, what is wrong with that? What isn't quite right about that picture? It's the deflector dish. Yeah, when they were doing the initial production shots and merchandising and things like that, this was what they were going with for the model of the Enterprise E. But then, of course, the script for First Contact was still in production, and they decided they needed to do this big, exciting battle sequence on the hull of the ship, and they decided to go with a deflector dish to do that. Now, you can see the problem. If you want to film a scene on a bright white light, that's going to look terrible. So they redesigned it so it was orange and more practical and have little jaggy pointy bits in it, etc, etc, etc. But most of these pictures were still out there. And because what the deflector dish looks like is such a small, inconsequential part of anybody's life, you can still see promotional material with this kind of design on it. I choose to believe that it just lights up like that sometimes, like a big torch in space, or I don't know, there could be a million reasons for it. I like to pretend it's all canon because my life is empty. Number 5, 25% new material. Now, we did talk about this a little bit in Star Trek Voyager because not all of that was a brand new set. Like, yes, they created some new stuff for it, like the bridge, etc., but they pretty much just recycled sets at Paramount where they could, and the same is true for the Enterprise E. Alright, so the bridge, that was brand new, engineering, that was brand new, and some of the corridors, they were brand new, but loads of other stuff is literally just Voyager. Now, the most obvious one here is the Enterprise E sickbay, because that is literally just the exact same sickbay as Voyager, and not just because Robert Picardo's in it, because it's just the same exact set. Voyager's cargo bay ended up being the weapons locker, Captain Janeway's quarters were Captain Picard's quarters, Voyager's ready room doubled for Counselor Troy's office, Voyager's boardroom stood in for Deanna Troy's bathroom, and Voyager's engineering section was eventually redressed as the Enterprise E library. And one final thing, if you just direct your attention here quickly, whose windows are those? They're Captain Janeway's windows. Nature abhors a vacuum, Star Trek abhors waste. Number 4, Frasier once captained the Enterprise E. I know sometimes we'll do stuff like this and people will be like, actually this is beta canon, you can't really include these in the secrets because it's all made up. But 1A, fight me nerds. 2B, look at this picture and tell me it's not worth including. Yes, in Diane Carey's 1997 novel Ships of the Line, Captain Morgan Batesman, the man who was captaining that ship in Cause and Effect, literally Kelsey Grammer, he is in charge of giving the Enterprise E its shakedown, and he gets into a bit of a bother with a load of Klingons in the process. Now, yes, of course, this is not technically canon, and it is just another thing aside, but look at the deflector dish. Remember what I told you. Number 3, a very special wall. Now you're all sitting there and you're thinking, Adam, if there's one thing I know about the Enterprise E, it's that it never once appeared in a single television episode of either Star Trek Deep Space Nine or Star Trek Voyager. They kept the big screen and the small screen separate. You cannot ever tell me that they crossed over, and I'm gonna tell you that they crossed over, but like the littlest bit. Right, so the Enterprise E was conspicuous by its absence in the whole Dominion War storyline. There it was, the most advanced ship Starfleet had that had literally handed a Borg cube its own arse, and it was nowhere to be seen during this, the biggest threat faced by the Alpha Quadrant. But at the exact same time, over in the Delta Quadrant was Star Trek Voyager, and they drafted in Deanna Troi from the Enterprise E to join in with the Reg Barkley Pathfinder storyline. So there's a little connection, although did we ever see it? Yes, Reg calls Deanna Troi to speak to her, and she is standing there on the Enterprise E, and the wall behind her is an actual set from the Enterprise E. So very, 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 very technically, you do see the Enterprise E in the TV of the 90s. It was in an episode of Star Trek Voyager, but it was literally just a generic wall. Which is disappointing, yes, but it is also proof that it was around somewhere. Honestly, I need to sit down with the producers and the writers and just whoever was in charge back then and just ask, I know you wanted them to be their own thing, I know they had to retain their own individuality, but just why could you not have one episode, or just in the background, I just need to know. I need to know why they didn't use the Enterprise E in the Dominion. What? That last shot in Voyager when all those ships take it back to Earth. Just throw it in there! Number 2, Enterprise E version 3. So a slightly interesting story. Between every single film the Enterprise E was in, it got a slight redesign. Nothing major, but they just took every single opportunity to just tweak a line here or smooth something down there or just rework the little bits to get it perfect. Which of course you can't do when using a CGI model. Like the Enterprise D was the same for every single episode of Star Trek The Next Generation because nobody wanted to start hacking into the physical models and having to recreate the exact same thing on all the different scales of it. That's a week's work, for Christ's sake. So in Insurrection, when they needed to add a captain's yacht, they looked at the underside where this was going to be and they started to smooth out all the lines around that, incorporating the torpedo launcher into what would eventually be the yacht. It's not there in First Contact, but they redid the whole underside of the hull to make it look smoother for Insurrection. But the biggest changes came before Nemesis because they knew they were building to this huge battle scene with a scimitar, so they reworked the shape of the whole ship. Like they smoothed out the differentiation between the saucer section and the hull. They added loads of different photon and quantum torpedo ports and more phaser strips for that battle scene. They also gave the nacelles a slight tweak, make them look more stable, more sweeping, because, well, look, they knew the ship was going to get the kicked out of it in that battle, so it might as well look sturdy enough to hold up to that. And the sad thing is, there was a 4th round of redesigns because they did not know that Nemesis was going to be the last film in the series. It was supposed to get fixed and reworked and upgraded and then sent out for some more films, so it was going to have a new paint scheme. It was going to look more in line with the original production sketches from First Contact, but of course, Nemesis bombed, so they pulled the plug, and it really was a generation's final journey, so we never got to see what that 4th version of the ship looked like. Number 1, the legacy of the E. Now, despite Nemesis getting everything canned, there were still some canon appearances of the Enterprise E after Nemesis, and these all took place in the run-up to J.J. Abrams' 2009 Star Trek film with the release of Countdown, a series of graphic novels designed to bridge the gap between where we left it in Nemesis and where Spock goes back in time. Now, under the command of Captain Data, who'd basically downloaded his consciousness into B4 and then asserted his personality over his brother, it was kind of convoluted, but it worked at the time. They took on Nero, they took on the Narada, but the illustrations they're open to interpretation. Like, I don't know, either they've completely redesigned that or it's just the way it's drawn. It's up to you. Now, of course, these graphic novels were registered non-canon with Star Trek Picard because they rewrote exactly what happened in that time frame. But with Picard did come its own series of graphic novels, some of which even featured the Enterprise E. So, long story short, it is still out there. It is under the command of Captain Worf, and it might just show up in Season 2. Fingers crossed.
10 secrets of the USS Enterprise F you need to know. Number 10, Verity on High. The arrival of the Enterprise F in Star Trek Picard wasn't actually the first time in canon that we saw an Odyssey-class vessel. IDW's graphic novel prequel series to Picard featured the USS Verity, NCC 97007. This was assigned to Admiral Picard to assist in the Romulan evacuation program, the precursor to the supernova that would kickstart not only the Kelvin universe, but also a lot of the action in Picard and beyond. As noted in an article for IDW itself, Star Trek Online's Thomas Maroney, the person who adapted the design to fit Star Trek Online, stated that in this period of history, there were 2 Odyssey-class ships created. One was the USS Verity, the other was the USS Odyssey. They were created as a direct response to the Riemann Scimitar. You all remember how big that was. And this was Starfleet's version of a heavy cruiser. The further we look into this, the backstory states that actually the Odyssey class was put on hold so that all of the resources for designing and building this fleet of ships could be put into the Verity to rush that into service for the Romulan evacuation. However, with the subsequent failure of the Romulan evacuation and the destruction of Utopia Planitia shipyards, the Odyssey itself was somewhat forgotten and the Verity was mothballed. We have a couple then of different backstories to the Odyssey class, depending on whether you follow Star Trek Online or whether you follow IDW's story. But it does remain that the Enterprise F is the only Odyssey class ship that has received any significant screen time in the episodes of Picard. Number 9, thanks for the support. Taking inspiration from the Enterprise F's online heritage, the one that we saw in the show did in fact feature a small docked support craft at the aft. In the spot that historically would see the shuttle bay on such ships like the Constitution class, we get the Aquarius class support ship. This is analogous to the Aero shuttle on Voyager and the Calypso captain's yacht of the Enterprise D, and like those, we never really got to see it do anything in the few minutes of screen time that the Enterprise F got. In Star Trek Online, the ship was actually destroyed in 2410 by Captain Sean, but naturally it was redesigned, rebuilt and redocked. The ship wasn't just a support craft in terms of getting people off the ship if needs be. It was different from a runabout in that way. It could actually enter a battle on the support side of the Enterprise F as well. Both the Aquarius and the Odyssey class actually got their names from the Apollo 13 space mission. They were named after the lander and the command module. Of course, that would go on to make sure that we would all remember the phrase, Houston, we've had a problem. Number 8, now for the stats. The best resource for information on the Enterprise F is Star Trek Online and the official breakdown that's given for the ship there. Built at the Utopia Planitia shipyard, the Enterprise F was armed with 18 Mark 12 phaser arrays, 4 variable payload warhead launchers, 2 phaser turrets, and 2 heavy phaser cannon mounts. A bit of beefed up firepower for the Enterprise F then. One thing that the design carried over from both the Galaxy and Sovereign class ships was that it had the ability to separate its saucer section. This was a little bit different, where the Enterprise D's saucer section was used effectively as a life raft to help people escape a battle scenario. The saucer section of the Enterprise F was designed to become a separate, fully operational battleship if the situation required it. it was in a way then closer in design to the experimental Prometheus class. There was, of course, an array of shuttles, there was also an Argo, which you will remember from Star Trek Nemesis, and there was several Yellowstone-class runabouts. Now, the Yellowstone was slightly different from the Danube class and was only seen once before in Star Trek Voyager's Non-Sequitur. There is also a captain's yacht and, of course, the previously mentioned Aquarius. Number 7. Feeling shunned? It only took 33 years, if you don't include the silent appearance in Star Trek Lower Decks, but Elizabeth Shelby returned to Star Trek. She had gone from the promotion-hungry Borg expert from Best of Both Worlds to become a full admiral who was ceremonially, at least, in charge of the Enterprise F during the Frontier Day celebrations. The Picard logs that were released online suggested that the ship has had a variety of captains over its lifespan, but in Star Trek Online, the Enterprise F is commanded by the Andorian Captain Vakel Shon. This makes him the third non-human commander of an Enterprise after Spock in The Wrath of Khan and Worf, if that little wink and nod is what we think it is, in the episode Vox. There are, of course, other variations. In Peter David's novel Imzadi from 1992, it suggests the Enterprise F is in service around 2408 and is commanded by none other than Data. The later DS9 series Millennium would also suggest that there was an Enterprise F, but this ship was a Defiant class that was built after the destruction of the Enterprise E. It was initially commanded by Jean-Luc Picard, later commanded by William Riker, until it too bit the bullet. Number 6. Competitive edge. The Enterprise F design actually came about from a competition run by Star Trek Online to celebrate its first anniversary, aptly named Design the Next Enterprise. This wasn't the first time that a competition like this had been run. The Pocket Books had actually run a similar competition with the Luna class USS Titan coming from that, designed by artist Sean Tarango. The success of the Luna class competition contributed to convincing CBS that this Design the New Enterprise idea was a good one, and so they ran with it, and they got thousands of entries, which were then narrowed down to about 25 before eventually being narrowed down to a final 4. The criteria for the design was relatively straightforward. Effectively, when you looked at it, you had to think iconic Federation starship. So 2 nacelles, deflector dish, primary hull, saucer section. With all of these aspects being included in his design, Adam Eel actually won the overall competition. Some of the other close to the first place entries included Jason Vector Lee's 4-nacelled ship that would actually be repurposed and reused as the USS Chimera in Star Trek Online, commanded by Captain Nog. Number 5. Screen time. The Enterprise F just misses out on the honor of having the shortest amount of screen time of any of the Enterprises. That honor goes to the Enterprise J, which we only really saw a design graphic of and a bit of the corridor that Daniels and Archer were standing in Enterprise's 3rd season. The Enterprise F appears in the last 2 episodes of Season 3 of Picard, Vox and The Last Generation. Now, it was shown quite heavily in the trailers and the marketing campaign, but it was also very quickly stated that it wasn't going to be the hero ship of the season, so as to kind of tease audiences, but also not set them up for, well, not seeing very much of it. The F was seen earlier in the season as a graphic on the file that Ro Laren gives to Picard, but apart from these few fleeting glimpses, we don't really get to see very much of it. Also, the return of the Enterprise D in the very last scene of Vox and of course The Last Generation does somewhat eclipse the Enterprise F just a bit, and considering that the Enterprise F was to be decommissioned after Frontier Day, it's unlikely that we're going to see her again for a while. Number 4. Size of it now. The Enterprise F reflected the way Enterprises had been going. You know, when you think the Enterprise B was bigger than the Enterprise A, C to the B, D, and then E is longer than D, but D is technically a bigger ship. But yes, It reflected the time of Starfleet's need for these larger vessels, be they for exploration or with the advanced dangers of the Dominion and the Borg, and I suppose the Romulans. The Starfleet needed more battleships. The Enterprise G, on the other hand, reflected this new, more peaceful era of Starfleet's history. So it was deemed to shrink the size of the flagship, and it would then become this Neo-Constitution class, which we had of course seen in the season as the Titan A. Things must have got a little hairy again as the years went on, because the Enterprise J is roughly the size of Earth's moon. Alright, that's a bit of an overstatement, but it is considerably larger. The Enterprise F is 1,061 meters long, as opposed to the Enterprise E, which was 685 meters. The Enterprise D was only 641 meters long, but as I stated, it was rather larger in other respects. This makes the Odyssey class the largest class of ship that had been seen in the Prime timeline up to that point. It does have fewer decks than the Enterprise D, 32 as opposed to 48. This, however, is in part due to its lengthier, more streamlined shape. This makes the Enterprise F around 2.5 times the size of the original Constitution class, which itself only had 23 decks to fit 430 crew. As they state in Trials and Tribulations, they really did pack them in on these old ships, just for fun. If we hop over into the Kelvin timeline, the USS Vengeance would still dwarf the Enterprise F. It is 1,450 meters long. That's a big ship. Number 3, crafty construction. One of the defining features of the Enterprise F is the double neck that it boasts, as opposed to the singular neck of almost all previous ships. According to the bonus issue of the Enterprise F from Eaglemoss's Star Trek Starships collection, Adam Eel's design was favoured because it was big and majestic. There were design cues from the Galaxy and Sovereign classes that made it feel familiar, and the double neck was the icing on the cake. Eel himself had revisited the work of original Enterprise designer Matt Jeffries, as well as the futuristic ideas of Doug Drexler for the Enterprise J, and of course Andrew Probert's design of the Enterprise D. He kept the overall shape quite similar to what had gone before. The primary hull was raised and separate from the secondary hull via this double neck. The nacelles were attached with backward-facing pylons. Quite simply put, it looked like an Enterprise. Cryptic's Thomas Maroney then made a couple of slight alterations when designing the ship for Star Trek Online. He widened the neck, for example, and he swept back the saucer a little bit over the engineering hull. To date, this is the only ship in canon that has this kind of distinct design. Number 2, short shelf life. According to Star Trek Picard, the NCC 1701F was only in service for about 15 years. It was being decommissioned in 2401's Frontier Day following a disastrous Monfette gambit that saw a catastrophic systems failure ship-wide. It was deemed easier just to decommission the ship than to repair it. Now, if that sounds like a bit of a short life for a ship, consider that the Enterprises A, B, C, D, and E all came in under that 15-year lifeline. In fact, D had the shortest lifespan at only 7 years, whereas the original Enterprise, if we include the refit as well, was going around for about 40 years. That record is not likely to be broken anytime soon. The Picard logs that preceded Star Trek Picard revealed that the ship had been commissioned in 2386. Executive producer and showrunner Terry Matalas stated that Admiral Shelby's posting of the Enterprise F was purely for the ceremonies of Frontier Day only. There was a series of unnamed in the show captains who had command during the Enterprise's lifespan. In Star Trek Online, however, the Enterprise F was only commissioned in 2409, which meant that the Enterprise E probably had a longer lifespan, although its final fate may still have not been Worf's fault. Number 1. No to the upgrade. The Enterprise F's appearance in Star Trek Picard cements itself in Prime canon that, we have seen it, it has been out there, and it got, 7 layers of hell kicked out of it by the Borg. But we won't think about that for the moment. What it does is that with the decommissioning of the Enterprise F on screen, it means that what happened in Star Trek Online is very unlikely to happen. Well, it can't, because the Enterprise G's already been commissioned. In Star Trek Online, the Enterprise F received a major overhaul and refit following the closing of the Iconian War. These refits included more prominent impulse engines, changes to the nacelles and the pylons, and a change of the overall paint scheme, and that's just on the outside. These were seen for the first time in the episode Scylla and Charybdis. Now, Eagle Moss's Star Trek Starships collection did in fact release a model of this refit Yorktown class. Eagle Moss released two variants of the original Enterprise F, one in the largely black and white livery that's seen in Star Trek Online, and one in a more traditional Starfleet grey. The producers of Star Trek Picard decided to go with the online version, which means, funnily enough, that grey model of the Enterprise F can really only be found as an option within Star Trek Online. And here are 10 secrets of the Enterprise G you need to know. Number 10. Word up, G. The arrival of the Enterprise G has meant that some parts of the expanded canon are now very firmly not canon anymore. Let's start with the Enterprise F. In Star Trek Online, that gets an upgrade from Odyssey class to Yorktown class. That now doesn't happen, as it's retired in the early 25th century after the Monfette Gambit. As it stands now, the G has not been made available on Star Trek Online. Speaking of Star Trek Online, the Titan continued on with the Luna class, which showed the Titan, Titan A, and once that was destroyed, the Titan B also continuing on in that frame as well. Star Trek Fleet Command has now actually shown the Constitution 3 class, with the Titan A crossing over onto its platform in the Kelvin timeline as part of that ongoing story. The now defunct fan series Frontiers, not to be confused with the WizKids game of the same name, showed the Enterprise G turning up there as an Excalibur class. That was designed by Stephen Davis, but now actually most of that would focus more on the Enterprise H. Unfortunately, it's difficult to find some of that, but you can still see images of that online. Number 9. Marvelous Medical. Among some of the most impressive sets built for the Titan A was in fact the medical bay, which Dave Blass, production designer, went into a lot more detail about. You never really know what action is going to take place there. Usually it's one person in a bed, but it's a huge ship, so you really need 10 to 12 beds. But that's a giant waste of space and money. Then you need a surgery bed and somewhere to sit and talk, as well as somewhere to look at medical readouts. So sickbay was just wrangling of the time and money beast and making it as big yet interesting as possible. Costs were further reduced actually for this set by the introduction of these kind of large OLED holographic type tubes. This holographic was very, very deliberate, as Blass said that it was able to give a more technological feel to the room without actually upping the budget considerably. Number 8. Pursuit Kraus. The design of the Enterprise G was based on the Shangri-La class and also inspired by the designs of Trek fan and designer Larry Miller in the 1980s, as Bill Krause explained. Originally, the idea for the Shangri-La class was something that could both stand out but also very much blend in with some of the original series movies as well. In fact, Krause looked to Andy Probert's designs so that it would be something that you could see theoretically becoming part of the lineage of Starfleet. Miller's Hornet class design was also used as a bit of inspiration for what would turn up as the USS Intrepid as well. Krause actually never expected this design to play as pivotal a role as possible. Terry Matalas found these designs via Krause's Instagram account and commissioned Krause to build a model for him. He thought it might show up in the background of an episode here or there, not in the, well, hero form it ended up taking in season 3. Number 7. Set pieces. 18 new sets were built for the Titan A, which of course would go on to be the Enterprise G. You might have noticed that the lower section of La Sirena was reused as the bridge of the Shrike, whereas, well, the standing set of the Stargazer's bridge from season 2 became the skeleton of what would become the Titan A's bridge in Season 3. New OLED screens were added to the Titan A bridge, along with some more panels, platforms, and stations, including the one that Picard used to fire torpedoes at one point. The observation lounge as well was given a bit of a touch-up from what we saw in Season 2, with the addition of course, the new models away from the Stargazer and Sagan class, moving towards the Constitution 3, and of course, the Luna class as well. With all of these new sets being designed, and the previously mentioned medical bay being the most complex of them, this was a massive undertaking at a time when a lot of what we see on screen is computer generated. Number 6. Shangri-La-La-La-La. The Enterprise G can trace its design lineage back to the 23rd century, with the original USS Titan being a Shangri-La class under the command of Captain Savick. It's a blink and you'll miss it moment, but the shuttle that Riker and Picard borrow to go over to the Helios 12 is in fact named the Savick after the captain of the first Titan. The Constitution 3 class was effectively a 25th century update of that original Shangri-La class, with the Luna class sort of slipping in the middle, if you like. Let's call that the grunge phase in the middle of their upbringing, and that, by the way, is not a word against Sean Tarango's design of the Luna class, which I love. While the overall design of the Constitution 3 is based heavily on the Shangri-La class, the actual nacelles were borrowed from Season 2's Sagan class USS Stargazer, with this difference being that they could be opened and tinkered with by some captain level grease monkeys. Number 5. Downsizing in the move. If you trace things from the original Enterprise right up to the Enterprise F, you can see that there is a trend of Enterprises tend to get bigger and bigger and bigger. You had crews of about 400 back in Kirk's day, right up to over 1,000 in Picard's day. You might think that, well, hold on, the Enterprise E didn't have anything like that complement, and you would be correct, although the Sovereign class is quite a bit longer than the Enterprise D's Galaxy class, so we're continuing that trend. Having said that as well, the Sovereign class was just over 600 meters, where the Odyssey class Enterprise F is about 1 kilometer long, so it's getting a bit ridiculous at that point. That's not even taking into account the Universe class Enterprise J. The Constitution 3 class actually brings everything down again, and this was a conscious decision by Terry Matalas, who explained in an interview with Inverse.com that he wanted to bring this ship back to the exploratory nature of Starfleet that had been sort of... After Wolf 359, we'd started to see the introduction of a more militaristic side of Starfleet, which, led to ships like the Defiant, the Enterprise E, the Akira class. The Constitution 3 Enterprise G was a deliberate attempt to go back to science vessels and exploring vessels, and, in Matalas' own words, would have its absolute ass kicked in the wrong situation. Number 4. What's in a name? The path to the Enterprise G is not actually quite as straightforward as you'd think. Shangri-La class designer Bill Krause explained that they would start as the Titan but end as the Picard, which would follow the overall arc of the season and ironically leave the show named after the ship, but just retroactively. The moment, however, in The Last Generation, which sees the shuttle come up over the bow of the now Enterprise G to reveal the new name, is a direct parallel to the tease at the end of Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, when Sulu says, "Actually, I'm counting on Excelsior," and then they rise up over the Excelsior to see the newly christened Enterprise A. There was a fun parallel in this as well. You see, originally, for The Next Generation, we were going to have NCC 10017. However, the choice to alphabetize the new Enterprise in Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home meant that we were going to not do the additional number at the end, but rather a letter. It was going to be the NCC 1701G. Now, this was brought down to 1701D to be more in line with the 78-year gap between the end of Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country and, of course, the beginning of Encounter at Farpoint. Number 3. Reconstituted. The decision to make the Enterprise G a Constitution 3 class was a very deliberate decision, and when the reveal happens, it makes quite a lot of sense.
You see, there's a parallel in the end of the voyage home, which sees the Enterprise A revealed as a Constitution class as well. Depending on which version of beta canon you follow here, you could either believe that it was renamed from the USS T-Ho in the 1980s book Mr. Scott's Guide to the Enterprise, or renamed for the, well, now coffin ship USS Yorktown. But either way, it was a renamed existing starship. Terry Matalas has said as well that Season 3 of Star Trek Picard was an origin story of the G, which is why when you look at episodes, particularly The Bounty and The Last Generation, you see the Enterprise G, A, NX-01, and the Enterprise D, and the Enterprise F, all on screen. Quite frankly, that's a lot of Enterprises. Number 2, not so new ship. There were a lot of theories around the arrival of a new hero ship for Picard's 3rd season. Of course, enter the Titan A, the Neo-Constitution class ship. There was quite a surprising reveal in that this was, in many ways, the exact same ship, Luna class, that a certain Captain William T. Riker had commanded. Yes, it was revealed that the Luna class USS Titan was heavily refit into the Neo-Constitution class. There's a couple of gags here and there where Shaw said he had to free up a few thousand gigabytes by trying to delete Riker's entire Jazz library from the computer systems as well. Now, it's not the first time that we've seen a massive refit of a starship. I mean, look at the Constitution to the Constitution refit of the motion picture. While perhaps not as drastic, it is still effectively a new ship built around the frame of the last one. In this, a lot of the computer systems, the nacelles, and the warp coils were directly held over, even if they did receive quite a bit of tinkering and changes. This also goes away toward explaining the addition of the A to the USS Discovery's registry after it too goes under a significant refit in the 3rd season of Star Trek Discovery. It also helps to hide it in time as well. Number 1, Captain's Prerogative. The paint is barely dry on the hull, and yet the Enterprise G already has quite the lineage behind it. Now, technically, if we're taking the physical ship into account here, there's already been 3 commanders of the Enterprise G. So first of all, from the Luna class, we have Captain William T. Riker. Then, of course, you've got Shaw taking over for the refit and for what ends up being the last 5 years of its life. Riker does take over again for a little while when Shaw's incapacitated, but as we see, when the ship is officially designated Enterprise G, you've got Captain 7 of 9 in the big seat. While we are still waiting on Star Trek Legacy to show us more of 7 in the captain's seat, it's actually not the record for the amount of commanders of an Enterprise. Look at the original one. You've got April, you've got Pike, you've got Kirk, you've got Commodore Decker, you've got his son, Will Decker, you've got Spock as well. And then, with varying kind of here and there's all the way in between. The Enterprise D had Picard a few times, we had Jellicoe. Now, the difference there is that did stay the Enterprise D, and although the original Enterprise had quite a few commanders, the Enterprise A sort of, kind of oscillates between Kirk and Spock depending on the afternoon. What I'm saying is that it's a privilege to be a captain of the Enterprise. God only knows how long you'll be one for. #Save7.